The air cracked with the roar of digital outrage, and Ethan said, "They turned on me overnight." His phone screen burned his eyes with trending hashtags calling him a fraud. Crowds outside his apartment shouted words he once thought impossible to hear. Glass bottles shattered against the pavement as if to punctuate each insult hurled his way. His career, his reputation, and his carefully built identity were already ash on the wind. Ethan said, "I risked everything for them, and now I'm the villain." News tickers rolled his name in bold, and anchors repeated accusations without proof. The city lights flickered against his pale face, his breaths ragged as the world devoured him. Ethan whispered, "How did it come to this?" But no one answered, not even his closest friends, who had gone silent. His trembling fingers hovered over his contacts, but calls went unanswered, texts unreturned. Betrayal was no longer abstract. It was the crushing silence of those who once praised him. His own reflection in the darkened window stared back with eyes full of shame. Ethan said, "They won't even hear my side." His voice cracked as he sat among torn newspaper clippings strewn across his apartment floor. Every headline screamed guilt. His chest tightened as silence pressed in. Friends he once trusted vanished into shadows of avoidance. His calls were ignored, his inbox flooded with hate. He whispered, "Why does nobody ask why I did it?" His truth remained buried beneath the mob's fury. He thought of Sarah, who once swore loyalty, but she hadn't returned his desperate texts. Ethan muttered, "Even she's gone." His breaths came shallow, heart racing with dread of tomorrow's headlines. The night deepened, but Ethan couldn't escape the sound of chants rising from outside. He clutched his knees to his chest as the crowd roared. Ethan said, "I thought I was protecting them." Yet now their voices drowned him. His phone buzzed again with another vicious message, and he hurled it across the room. Silence followed, but only for a second before the mob's thunder broke in again. Ethan whispered, "This storm won't pass." His reflection in the window stared back, fragile and broken. On television, another commentator sneered, replaying Ethan's past speeches as though mocking his integrity. Ethan said, "They twist every word." The camera froze his smile mid-speech, now weaponized against him. Old allies nodded along in silence, refusing to defend. Betrayal was worse than anger. It was abandonment. Ethan pressed his palm against the TV screen as though trying to reach through, his breath fogging the glass. He whispered, "I am not who they say I am." But the echo answered nothing. The apartment walls closed in as Ethan scrolled through a sea of condemnation, each comment carved deeper than the last. He said, "They want me erased." His eyes stung from sleepless hours. Sarah's silence screamed louder than the mob, and Ethan muttered, "She promised to stand by me." His thoughts spiraled into fear that tomorrow would bring another wave of disgrace. Outside, chants still echoed, relentless, merciless. Ethan said, "This isn't living anymore." His hands shook as he covered his face, darkness pulling him down. The silence that followed Ethan's fall felt more suffocating than the chaos itself. No one spoke. Ethan said, "The worst part is knowing I'm being forgotten." His phone had become an echo chamber of insults, and his friends, those who once rallied behind him, had vanished. His isolation was the sharpest wound. Ethan had hoped for a lifeline, a call from someone who truly understood, but instead his inbox filled with venomous words. Each message stung worse than the last. "Why didn't they stand by me?" he muttered. The betrayal felt complete. Sponsors who once admired him now distanced themselves, and Ethan could feel his future slipping away with each passing second. He said, "I didn't deserve this." The weight of their silence crushed him, leaving only a bitter taste of defeat. His once stellar reputation was now a distant memory. Alone, he watched the world move on without him, a cold reminder of the price he'd paid. "Maybe I should have just stayed silent," he whispered, but it was too late for that. Days turned into weeks, and yet the world seemed to forget Ethan had once been a hero. Sarah had stopped replying. He said, "She was supposed to be here." The silence between them grew louder. He tried to move forward, but it was like wading through thick mud. Everything felt pointless. Ethan wondered if he would ever see the end of this nightmare. He hadn't slept properly in days, his mind racing through the thoughts of what might have been. "I tried to protect them," he whispered to himself, staring at the wall. But who was there to protect him now? The world that had once embraced him with open arms now pointed fingers at his every mistake. He questioned if the public would ever see the truth, or if they'd always judge him by a single moment. He sank into his couch, exhausted. The pain of abandonment was consuming him. Ethan said, "I don't even know who I am anymore." Ethan hadn't heard from anyone in days. His notifications pinged constantly, but they were filled with derogatory comments. How did it all fall apart so quickly? Ethan asked aloud, as if expecting the empty apartment to answer. The weight of public opinion felt more real than his own thoughts. Each time he opened his phone, it was as if the world was reminding him how low he had sunk. No one believed him. No one cared enough to listen. His career was in shambles, and the future seemed impossibly bleak. Ethan said, "I tried to make things right, but no one's listening." He scrolled through old messages from Sarah, her sweet words now tinged with sarcasm, her absence a reminder of how everything had changed. The guilt gnawed at him, but more than that, the loneliness crushed him deeper than any public backlash ever could. He whispered, "Am I just a ghost now?" Ethan walked the streets, trying to escape the confinement of his apartment, but it was like walking through a fog. He could hear the whispers of people around him, even though they weren't speaking directly to him. "It's just easier to ignore me," he muttered. He wanted to scream, to confront someone, anyone, but all he had were memories of what he used to be. Someone admired, someone respected. He said, "I never wanted this." But the public had made their choice, and it was a choice he could never take back. People looked through him as if he didn't exist. Ethan felt his humanity slipping away piece by piece. He said, "I didn't ask for any of this." His heart sank with each step, the weight of judgment pressing on his shoulders. He couldn't run from the past, not even in the quiet streets that once felt like home. Ethan spent the days in a blur. His thoughts, once sharp, were now muddled, clouded by self-doubt and guilt. He said, "I never wanted to hurt anyone." The betrayal he felt was deep, like a wound that wouldn't heal. Yet, with every passing moment, the world seemed to move farther away from him. His phone vibrated once again with a new message, another critic, another accusation. But this time, Ethan didn't look. Instead, he sat by the window, staring out at the dark sky, the raindrops running down the glass like the years of his life slipping away. "I'm fading," he said softly, voice almost drowned by the sound of rain. The world he had once known no longer felt like a place he belonged. His future was uncertain, and he wondered if he would ever be able to find redemption. But the truth was, redemption seemed like a distant dream, something out of reach. Ethan sat in the quiet of his apartment, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the only sound breaking the silence. The chaos of the past week still echoed in his mind. "It wasn't supposed to end like this," he murmured. His fingers hovered over his phone, not knowing whether to reach out or to retreat further into the shadows. The messages kept flooding in, criticism, disdain, even hate. But none of them told the full story. "Why didn't anyone ask me why I did it?" he asked, staring into the empty space ahead. The media had already made their decision. The public had their narrative. The accusations still haunted him, but he was learning how to live with them. He whispered, "I just want someone to hear my side." But no one came. His mind raced through the events that led him here, to this point of isolation. Was it worth it? He questioned. But the answer was already clear. No. He didn't change the past, but the future, his future, felt just as lost as the day this all began. The days blurred together as Ethan continued to wrestle with the fallout. His thoughts twisted in a never-ending loop. "I was just trying to protect them," he whispered to himself. He had thought the truth would set him free, but the truth only seemed to make things worse. He knew the public would never hear it, not after the damage had already been done. The messages kept coming, and Sarah, his once closest confidant, hadn't returned a single text in over a week. "I don't know what happened," he said aloud, his voice barely audible. His heart ached, not just from the cancellation, but from the betrayal of those he had trusted most. He ran his hand through his hair, frustration building. Why is it that the ones you trust most are the first to turn their backs on you? Ethan couldn't help but wonder if his life would ever be the same. Can anyone ever truly know the whole story? A notification pinged, and for a moment, Ethan thought it was Sarah. But it was just another critical article about him, another person adding fuel to the fire. "How did it all get so out of control?" he muttered, slamming his fist on the table in frustration. The mob had made its decision, and nothing could undo it now. Even the ones who claimed to stand with him began to distance themselves, afraid of getting caught in the crossfire. "Did I make a mistake?" he asked himself. The question lingered in the air, unanswered. He felt like an outsider, disconnected from everything he had once known. The life he had built seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a cold, judgmental world. Ethan stood up abruptly, pacing the small room. "What happened to loyalty? What happened to friendship?" he asked, his voice trembling with raw emotion. But no one was there to answer. The weight of the cancellation seemed to press down on Ethan every moment of the day. "They don't care," he whispered. It was a realization that hit harder than any insult or criticism. He had been abandoned, not just by friends, but by the very system that once praised him. Ethan had tried to explain himself, to share the truth. But the truth was just another casualty in this battle. "I've lost everything," he said with a hollow laugh. His voice cracked, the rawness of his words hanging in the air. For all the noise outside, his apartment felt suffocatingly silent. No one cared enough to listen, and those who did were too afraid to speak out. Ethan collapsed onto his couch, staring up at the ceiling. "This is my life now," he muttered, feeling the weight of his own words. Days began to feel like weeks, and Ethan couldn't escape the feeling that his life had been irrevocably changed. "I'll never be the same again," he said softly, a tear sliding down his cheek. He thought of the friends he had lost, the people who had once been close, and how quickly they had turned away. "I didn't deserve this," he whispered. The regret settled in, a heavy, unshakable weight. He wanted to scream, to confront those who had condemned him without ever hearing his side. But instead, he just sat there, numb. The city outside his window felt distant, almost unreal. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said, his voice breaking. The silence in the room felt deafening, and Ethan wondered if anyone would ever truly understand. It had been weeks since Ethan last heard from Sarah. The silence between them had grown into an insurmountable wall. He said, "I never wanted it to end like this." But the truth felt heavier than the words he spoke. His heart ached for the connection they once shared, but it was as if she had disappeared, swept away by the tide of judgment that now controlled their lives. He had tried to reach out, to explain, but the truth had already been buried beneath the weight of the public's perception. He had become a symbol of failure, and she, like everyone else, was too afraid to stand beside him. Ethan slumped on his couch, his gaze fixed on the phone that no longer rang with comforting words. He muttered, "What happened to us?" The silence in the room was deafening, a constant reminder of the chasm that had grown between them. "I never wanted to be alone," he whispered, but no one was there to answer. Ethan's days blended into one another, a constant cycle of waking up to disappointment and falling asleep to regret. He said, "It feels like I'm in a nightmare." The world outside his apartment continued as usual, but inside, everything was frozen in time. The empty spaces where friends once stood had now become vacant memories. He reached for his phone again, only to pull away when he saw the flood of messages that seemed to mock him. What did I do wrong? Ethan wondered aloud. He had tried to make it right, to offer explanations, but every attempt seemed to only make things worse. He thought of Sarah, of the life they might have had, Why did they have to judge me without knowing the truth? His voice cracked with the pain of realization. Truth no longer mattered. What mattered was what the world believed, and Ethan's truth was now lost in the noise. The crowd had grown louder, their chants becoming impossible to ignore. It felt as though the world had turned its back on him. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible above the noise outside. The accusations rang in his ears, the weight of each word sinking deeper into his soul. "How did I become the villain?" he asked, pacing the apartment, unable to escape the constant reminder of what had happened. The anger and fear that had once driven him now seemed like distant memories. Why does the world care more about scandal than truth? His frustration boiled over, but it was useless. No matter what he said or did, he couldn't change their minds. Ethan stood in front of the window, staring out at the protesters gathered outside. "I never asked for this," he muttered, his voice full of quiet resignation. As the days stretched on, Ethan's isolation grew unbearable. His phone lay abandoned on the table, a symbol of all that had been lost. He said, "I can't keep going like this." His life, once full of possibility, now felt like a distant dream. He wondered if there would ever be an end to the torment, if he would ever be able to walk out the door without feeling the weight of the world's judgment on his shoulders. "I didn't deserve this," Ethan whispered, his voice filled with exhaustion. Every attempt to reclaim his life only led to more disappointment. He wondered if there was any point in trying anymore. He looked around the apartment, the silence pressing in from all sides. "Maybe I should just disappear," he said, a haunting thought slipping into his mind. But he couldn't. He couldn't let the world win. Ethan felt like he was suffocating. The world had built him up only to tear him down, and now it seemed there was no way out. "Is this how it ends?" he whispered to himself, staring blankly at the wall. Every step forward felt like it led him into deeper darkness. The weight of public opinion had crushed him, and now he was a shell of the person he had once been. He tried to hold on to the hope that things would improve, but each day seemed to bring only more despair. "What if this is all I'll ever be remembered for?" he asked, his voice breaking. Ethan's gaze lingered on the empty space beside him, the place where Sarah used to sit. "She's gone too," he muttered. He felt the finality of it all, the crushing realization that the life he had known was no more. His chest tightened with a deep, unshakable sorrow. "Maybe I never had a chance," he said softly. Ethan's phone buzzed once again, but this time he didn't reach for it. "I've had enough," he said, his voice barely a whisper, as though speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile silence around him. His hands trembled at his sides. This battle, the one he had fought for so long, felt over. The public's perception was set, and there was nothing left for him to prove. The world had already decided who he was, and no matter what he said or did, it wouldn't change their minds. "I can't do this anymore," Ethan muttered, his face pale and drawn. The constant pressure, the crushing weight of the judgment, had drained him of everything. He wanted to fight back, to scream out the truth, but the words felt hollow now. No one would listen. "I just wanted to be heard," he whispered, the pain of being misunderstood gnawing at his insides. He glanced at the empty room, his heart heavy with regret. There was no redemption here. Only the bitter reality of a life lost to the crowd's anger. The thought of confronting the crowd, of facing the people who had condemned him, was terrifying. Ethan stood by the window, staring out at the city, lost in thought. "What's the point?" he asked himself. "What's the point in fighting when they've already made up their minds?" The world outside was bustling, moving forward as if nothing had happened. But for Ethan, everything had stopped. The people who once admired him, the ones he thought would stand by him, were now silent. "I was just trying to make a difference," he said, his voice cracking. "But I couldn't even save myself." The weight of the public's rejection felt like a suffocating force pressing down on him. "I'm just a shadow now," he whispered, his words barely audible. The silence around him was deafening, and he could feel the isolation settling in like an old friend, one that would never leave. Ethan had tried to move on, to pick up the pieces of his shattered life, but it felt impossible. Every step forward was met with another reminder of what he had lost. "I never thought it would end like this," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. The media had painted him as the villain, and no amount of apologies or explanations would change their minds. "Maybe they're right," he muttered, staring at his reflection in the dark window. "Maybe I am the monster they say I am." The idea of redemption seemed like a distant dream, fading further and further with each passing day. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered. The loneliness, the emptiness was overwhelming. "I've lost everything," he said, his voice heavy with regret. And in that moment, Ethan felt as though the person he used to be was completely gone. Ethan paced the apartment, his mind racing, but his body felt too tired to move forward. "Maybe this is how it's always going to be," he said, his voice trembling. "Maybe I'm just meant to be the one who lost everything." He had reached out for help, but the silence he received in return had been the loudest rejection of all. "I thought I could overcome this," Ethan whispered, "but I'm not sure I can anymore." The walls of the apartment seemed to close in on him, and with every passing moment, the weight of the world's judgment pressed harder. He wanted to feel hope, to believe that things could turn around, but it seemed so far out of reach. "What do I even have left?" he asked, his voice full of emptiness. He collapsed on the couch, staring at the ceiling. "It's over," he whispered, the finality of his words settling over him like a heavy fog. The days blurred together as Ethan struggled to find a way out of the darkness that had enveloped him. "Maybe there's no way out," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. He had tried so hard to fight, to make the world see the truth. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. "I'll never be able to take it back," he whispered. The idea of redemption seemed impossible, and the weight of the past hung around him like a heavy chain. "I don't know if I'll ever be free of this," Ethan said, staring at the rain outside his window. The world had moved on, leaving him behind in the ruins of his own making. He wanted to scream, to let it all out, but he couldn't find the words. The silence felt louder than any voice could. "This is who I am now," he said, his voice breaking. Ethan had stopped checking his phone. The constant barrage of notifications had become a background noise he could no longer bear. "I'm invisible now," he whispered, his voice barely rising above the silence of the apartment. He stood by the window, staring out at the world moving on without him. The truth he had clung to seemed like a distant memory, fading with every passing day. "It's like I don't even exist anymore," Ethan said, his face devoid of emotion, his thoughts clouded by the overwhelming weight of his isolation. The world had long since turned its back on him, and yet here he was, still trying to find a way out of the darkness. "I keep asking myself, how did I get here?" But the answer eluded him. Nothing had prepared him for the aftermath of the storm. The betrayal, the loss, and the crushing silence that followed. It was all too much. "Maybe it was never meant to be," he said, the realization sinking in slowly. Ethan's mind wandered to Sarah, to what could have been. "I thought we had something real," he whispered, his heart aching as he thought of her. The silence between them was now deafening. She had been the one person he thought would stay, but even she had turned away. "Maybe I wasn't enough," he said, staring at the empty space beside him. "I was just trying to help, to make a difference." But no one saw it that way. They only saw a man who had fallen, a man who had let them down. "I can't blame her," Ethan muttered. "No one wants to be associated with a failure." The weight of the world's judgment felt unbearable. And even though he knew it wasn't true, he couldn't help but wonder if it had all been his fault. "If only I could go back," he said, but deep down, he knew that the past was beyond his reach. The idea of redemption seemed more distant than ever. "I don't think I can ever make this right," Ethan muttered, his voice heavy with defeat. The messages, the protests, the accusations, they all felt like they were suffocating him. He had tried to explain himself, to make them understand, but it had all been in vain. "Why does it feel like no one will ever forgive me?" he said, his eyes staring into the distance as if searching for an answer that would never come. The weight of the situation was too much to bear. He had given everything, and yet, it wasn't enough. Maybe I was wrong to even try, Ethan said bitterly. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to help. But the truth had been twisted, and now he was left alone, lost in a world that seemed to have no place for him anymore. There was a moment, a fleeting second, when Ethan wondered if he could walk away from it all. Maybe I'm not meant for this world anymore, he said, his voice low and resigned. He stood by the window again, looking out at the people who continued their lives as if nothing had changed. It's like I'm invisible to them, he whispered, the feeling of being unnoticed and unwanted settling heavily in his chest. He had once been a part of that world, but now he felt like an outsider, a stranger in his own life. Maybe I should just leave, Ethan thought, the thought of disappearing both tempting and terrifying. But where would I go? He asked, his words trailing off into the silence of the room. The thought of starting over seemed impossible. I don't know how to fix this, he said, the hopelessness in his voice palpable. It was in this quiet moment, when Ethan was alone with his thoughts, that he realized something he hadn't before. Maybe this is who I am now, he said softly, a sense of acceptance creeping into his voice. The weight of the past hadn't lifted, but he had begun to understand that he couldn't change what had happened. I can't keep fighting, he whispered. It's over. The realization settled over him like a heavy fog, but this time it didn't feel like defeat. It felt like release. I don't need their forgiveness, Ethan said quietly, his eyes closed, a small sense of peace beginning to form in his chest. I only need to find a way to live with myself. The path forward wasn't clear, but for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt as though he could take the next step, however small it might be. I'll find a way to move on, he said, his voice steady but unsure. The quiet of Ethan's apartment had grown less oppressive in the days following his realization. Maybe I'm not the person I once thought I was, he whispered, his voice steady but uncertain. He had come to terms with his new reality, though it was still difficult to accept. The weight of his past decisions had begun to feel more like a scar than a wound. I won't be defined by this, he said, looking out at the city through his window, the early morning light casting long shadows in the room. He had come to understand that this chapter of his life didn't have to define him forever. It's time to rebuild, he said quietly, but his words felt like a promise to himself rather than an announcement to the world. Maybe I'll never get the forgiveness I wanted, he said, turning his gaze away from the city streets, but I can find peace. The idea of moving forward was daunting, but he had finally accepted that it was the only way left for him to truly heal. Ethan's first steps toward reclaiming his life were small but significant. I've spent so long in this dark place, he said, pacing slowly across the apartment. It's hard to see the light again. But he had started looking for it, searching for ways to pull himself from the depths of his despair. I need to do something with this pain, he muttered, a new sense of determination in his voice. The memories still stung, but now they were driving him, not breaking him. It's not going to be easy, he said, his hand gripping the edge of his kitchen counter, but I can't stay here forever. The past had taken its toll, but Ethan had finally realized that it wasn't the end of his story. I've got to keep moving forward, he said firmly, even though doubt still crept in. But for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he had a direction, even if it was uncertain. The world still had its eyes on him, but Ethan had stopped caring about their judgment. They can think what they want, he said with a quiet but confident breath. I know who I am. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer held him captive. He walked through the city streets, the familiar sounds of the world around him, no longer feeling alien. Maybe they'll never see the real me, he muttered, his gaze forward, but I'm starting to see myself again. There was a quiet strength in him now, one that had been forged through pain and loss. I don't need their approval, Ethan said, his voice soft but filled with conviction. I just need to move forward, for me. As he walked, he felt lighter, not because the world had forgiven him, but because he had finally learned to forgive himself. The journey to forgiveness, both from others and himself, was long and uncertain. I don't know what the future holds, Ethan said, his voice introspective as he sat in a quiet park, watching the sunset. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, but even that beauty felt bittersweet. I've lost a lot, he admitted, and maybe I'll never regain it. His thoughts lingered on Sarah, on the life he thought he had. But he also realized that there was a new possibility ahead of him, even if he couldn't see it clearly yet. Maybe I can still be something better, he said, more to himself than anyone else. His hands rested in his lap, fingers slightly trembling, but there was a quiet resolve in his gaze. I can't change the past, Ethan whispered, but I can start shaping my future. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope, faint but real, as the world continued to turn around him. As the days passed, Ethan found himself changing, not because the world had accepted him, but because he had learned to accept himself. Maybe it's not about redemption, he said, his voice steady and filled with a newfound peace. Maybe it's about finding peace within myself despite everything. The journey had been painful, filled with moments of doubt and regret, but it had also led him to a place of quiet strength. I've learned that sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself, he said softly, the realization heavy but freeing. Ethan stood by the window again, watching the world outside, but this time he didn't feel disconnected. I may never get everything back, he said, his voice filled with quiet finality, but I've got myself, and that's enough for now. As he turned away from the window, a sense of calm washed over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he could face the future.